Thank you. I'd like to thank the organizers for inviting me to this very important meeting. Trying to get rid of this feedback here. I'd like to start with my conclusions, which are as follows: that on current evidence, and the 21st century hazards have only recently been documented, show that prolonged smokers lose about a decade of life versus a typical non-smoker. And that cessation, particularly by age 40 and preferably earlier, is very effective. It can avoid almost all of the excess of continuing to smoke. I will talk about tobacco as a big cause of poverty, and also that tobacco control can reduce poverty. And I'll conclude by talking about the impact of a tripling of the excise tax on cigarettes worldwide, which would roughly cut consumption by about a third and avoid 200 million deaths. Now, I'm an epidemiologist, so I'll apologize by giving you lots of numbers through this talk. And you know, the criticism of epidemiologists is that we're mere number crunchers like accountants. And that's not fair, because accountants have more personality than epidemiologists. So worldwide, there's about 5 to 6 million deaths from tobacco currently, but rising to about 10 million by mid-century. And 2 million are in developed countries, and about 1 million each in China and India, which I'll show you in some detail. Well, how does tobacco compare to other major risk factors? Well, there's about 1.3 billion smokers, 5 million deaths, about 2 billion drinkers, and about 2 million deaths, and much of that is concentrated from excess binge drinking, which I'll show you. Illicit drugs is a smaller population, smaller burden, and obesity, characterized by a body mass above 30, is also an important cause of death. But at the individual level, the key risk of death really is greatest for smoking. And you can characterize this at a broad level, at a macro level, that every ton of tobacco produced leads to about 1 million sticks and 1 death. And we've had now an increase of the tobacco production from 5 trillion cigarettes in 1990 to 6 trillion. So roughly, if you divide that, then you get 5 million deaths, which is what we have. And there's about $50 billion of profit by the tobacco industry. So if you divide that by 5 million deaths, you get roughly $10,000 profit per death. Let's start with the comparison of alcohol risks. Now, the key public health message here is don't drink like a Russian male. And if you look at the enormous fluctuations that have occurred in Russian overall death rates at ages 15 to 54, you know, death rates shouldn't be very common at that, deaths shouldn't be common at those age ranges. And sure enough, you see in the UK a gradual decline. But look at the enormous fluctuations from 1980 onwards. Now, prior to 1980, the high mortality in Russia was due to smoking and alcohol, but the recent fluctuations are almost all due to alcohol. So you see when Mr. Gorbachev came in around 1985, didn't like to see lots of drunken people, and put some restrictions in, death rates went down. He lost power. Boris Yeltsin, who you all remember, came in, and up went the consumption. And this was nicely sorted out. The epidemiologist nicely sorted out by David Zaritse and colleagues who studied in Russia men who had died. And if you want to know reliably how Russian males drink, ask their wives after they're dead, and you'll get accurate answers. And what they did is they looked at cases of men who drank a bottle of vodka a day, and they compared them with the controls. Now, they couldn't find any non-drinking controls, so the controls are 20 shots a week, or half a bottles a week. And there was a big excess in almost all of the causes of death. But that's Russia. Russia is unique in that it is one of the unique populations where alcohol is causing more deaths than smoking. In most other populations, smoking is causing more deaths. Okay, what about obesity? Michelle Obama has described obesity as the next tobacco. Well, as I'll show you, on the right side, that the contemporary evidence suggests that a typical smoker loses a decade of life. Now, to get that same degree of life lost, you have to have very high levels of obesity, roughly a body mass of 40, on a mean body mass of 43. So in my case, I have a BMI right at 25, and for me to have the same loss of being a typical smoker, I'd have to put on 50 kilograms. Now that's not the typical distribution, even in an obese country like the United States. There's much more modest obesity, and modest obesity does contribute to about 3 years of life lost, but not the decade of life lost. Now that may change as we get adolescent obesity going into adult obesity, but for currently, smoking causes more deaths than obesity. Now, Richard Pito wanted me to mention Valerie Burrell's important findings about happiness, which basically is that from the Million Women study, happiness didn't really predict your 10-year risk of death, whereas there was unambiguous relationship with the amount of smoking. I think the good news is that if you can be an unhappy non-smoker, you're still better off. So what are the contemporary hazards? Surprisingly, only in the last few years did we assemble. There was a meeting on the 100th birth centenary of Richard Doll in Oxford in 2012, and quite a few of us met to compare notes. And what we found was this remarkable consistency where across populations you see about a decade of life lost. So that's in UK men and women, that's the Richard Doll's last study and the Million Women study. In the US, which is our studies, which I'll show you in detail, among Japanese atomic bomb survivors and in Indian men. And Emily Banks in Australia has shown the same. So this is how Brian Williams from NBC summarized our study.
And good news and bad news on the smoking front from the New England Journal of Medicine. They state flat out smokers lose at least 1 decade of life expectancy over non-smokers on average. The encouraging news here is quitting before 40 reduces the smoking-related death risk by 90% compared to continuing on as a smoker.
That's 66 years of epidemiology in 22 seconds, and that's all you need to know about tobacco. So in the US, the study that we did was through this unique system where they surveyed the population, they linked them to national death index, which I call death book, or the Facebook of death. And what it showed is that women who smoked seriously, meaning they started early in life and did not quit, had now the same risks as men, who we've known for a long time, have the same risks, roughly threefold. And that's important because it suggests not just half, but perhaps 2/3 of smokers are killed by their addiction. And this is shown for the particular diseases that we know are strongly linked to smoking. So lung cancer, equal risks. Respiratory disease, now equal risks. So what this reflects in some detail is the maturation of the exposure of smoking in women. So in the 1950s, when the American Cancer Society did its first prospective studies, they didn't see a link between women's smoking and lung cancer. In fact, this was used as an argument by the tobacco industry to argue against control. But that's simply because the women had not been smoking long enough. As the cohorts of women that smoke seriously were followed, their risks now, as shown in the red, are the same as for men. So what does this mean in terms of survival probabilities? Well, Richard Doll used to remind us you can't live forever, but you can live till old age in good health. And if you take the simple proposition of living between ages 25 and 80 in the United States, there's a remarkable divergence between smokers and non-smokers. A non-smoker has about a 70% chance, a female non-smoker, of reaching age 80, and mostly is going to be in good health. But if you're a typical smoker, you have less than half that probability, or about half that probability. And that's adjusting for the usual differences between smokers and non-smokers in alcohol and other risk factors. Now, the good news is because the hazards of smoking are so big, the benefits of cessation are actually ridiculously effective. Those that quit by average age of 30 get back almost all of the 10 years of life lost. Quit by 40, get back 9 years. Quit by 50, get back 6 years. And quit by 60, you get back 4 years of life. Now, this is true in the Million Women study as well for overall mortality. And in fact, the main persisting risks for smokers is from lung cancer. And you see, even those that quit by age 40 still have a threefold higher risk of lung cancer, even with cessation. But you have to compare that risk to a 23-fold higher risk of continuing to smoke. So there is some residual risk, but it's nothing like the continuing risk. Well, in populations that have taken tobacco control seriously, we have seen extraordinary reductions, and perhaps none as startling as what Australia has achieved. In 1970, about 42% of middle-aged men would drop dead before age 70. Now, my definition of middle age changes as I grow older, but roughly I'm going to talk about 30 to 69 or 35 to 69. So look at the remarkable decrease in overall mortality shown in the white. That's down 2/3. But in the shaded, look at the remarkable reduction in tobacco attributable mortality. It was halved from about 16 to 8 and then halved further. So there's about an 80% reduction in smoking attributable mortality in men in Australia. Just remarkable progress. And this is reflected in the absolute numbers of deaths that you see here on the left, going from about 11,000 annual deaths in middle age down to about 4, and the female epidemic has stabilized. Now, there's still room for more progress here, as we'll discuss at this conference. Okay, now that's at the national level in high-income countries, but we can look further by looking at subgroups. And one of the important considerations is that smoking probably accounts for about half of the inequalities in male mortality, the social inequalities in high-income countries. So these are our comparison for 4 countries, but if you just focus on the US, you see that those with lowest education had about a 37% chance of dying, of which about 40% was due to smoking. In the highest education group, that risk was much lower, and only about 20% of the risk was due to smoking. If you take away the gray bars, the inequalities between rich and poor, educated, uneducated, in mortality would decrease. Now, we also are learning evidence at the subnational level. And for example, this is a comparison, same type of the overall risk and the tobacco attributable risk, contrasting US white men and Ontario men. And you'll see that in the US white men, there actually has been overall reductions, about 13%. So, but in Ontario, we've had a greater reduction of 26%. Now, note that tobacco has declined in both populations importantly, and by about 40%. But if you look at the difference between in the US white men, that shows stagnation in white male mortality. And that's been described by Angus Deaton and others. But the key point is that in the absence of tobacco control, those inequalities would be worse, and that stagnation would have been greater. In fact, we've done some work looking at the absolute decline in tobacco attributable mortality by counties in the US. And in fact, you see greater absolute declines in the Republican counties than in the Democratic counties. So it suggests that, in fact, tobacco control is saving the lives of would-be Trump supporters. It's not a bad thing. We save lives in public health regardless of political perspective. So now let's turn to developing countries. So China already has 1 million smoking deaths, but it's rising rapidly. And it is because that same phenomenon that I showed you for women, the generations of smokers that start early and don't quit is now coming into middle ages. And 2 prospective studies, one in the 1990s and one recently by Zhenming Chen, have documented the extraordinary increase that has occurred in the risks. And what do we see? Well, in the 1990s, about 12% of deaths in men, in middle-aged men, was due to smoking. By 2010, it had risen to 20%, 25% in urban populations, and those are the ones that are starting early and not quitting, but also 15% in rural. As a measure, Hong Kong, which started smoking seriously among the men about 2 decades earlier, is already at about 33%. So it's fair to say China will reach about 1/3 of all deaths from smoking that is being seen here. India is similar but different in that most commonly the type of tobacco smoke is bidis, the small cigarettes. And men who smoke bidis lose 6 years of life. The few women who smoke bidis lose 8 years. And surprisingly, the men who smoke cigarettes lose 10 years of life. It's surprising because they don't smoke much and they start late in life, but the risks seem to be quite extreme. And what we've done recently with the Million Deaths study is look at the maturation of the epidemic, particularly as the cigarette displaces the bidi. And you'll see in the darker triangles, or the darker diamonds, the increased risk over time for the major causes of death. So for example, respiratory death rates are greater now than they were just 10 years ago. So what works? Well, there's been a variety of reviews of global tobacco control, including this work that I did at the World Bank and lots of follow-up work, but the messages from them are very simple. The most important is that taxes are the single best intervention to get current smokers to quit. 100% tax hike or 100% price hike from even a larger tax would get about 20% of current smokers to quit. The effects are greater in the youth and in the poor. And importantly, a big single increase, let's say a one-time increase of 100%, is more effective than several smaller increases, like 10 years of 10%. Price responsive does not decrease as the price goes higher. And we heard that when we were out in Tasmania, concerns that the Australian prices are high. Can you go higher? Yes, the economic evidence suggests that the responsiveness does not diminish at very high levels. And similarly, there's a myth that there's a so-called hardcore addicted smoker, typically lower socioeconomic status. But again, the economic evidence doesn't suggest that. They will respond to prices as well. Now, we see this in not just in economic theory, but we see this in practice in France, of all places. You think France is not a typical place you think for tobacco control, but in fact, they were able to have their consumption from 6 cigarettes per day, per adult per day, down to 3 in only 12 years. By contrast, in Canada, it took us about 35 years to have consumption from 12 cigarettes down to 6. In the US, it took about 40 years. And they did so because Jacques Chirac, in 1992, said he would raise the tax on cigarettes by 5% above inflation and announced that. And you see the big increase in price and the reduction. So it's a simple relationship. The prices tripled, consumption halved, and they also got about 6 billion more euros, so revenue had doubled. Exactly the same scenario in South Africa. This inverse relationship has occurred. But we are being outsmarted by the tobacco industry in that finance ministries know about taxes. I haven't met a finance minister who never met a tax they didn't like, but we've been outsmarted because the tobacco industry goes and gives advice saying, well, look, sock it to us, but make small increases and don't disrupt the market. Much of the things Peter says in terms of their advice. But what is needed is a big, smart tax hike. And that involves specifically the use of tobacco excises, not the value-added tax, because the industry can manipulate that. And that produces more stable revenue, it's better against smuggling, and it has a greater impact. And in some cases, we've actually had success on this. We were able to convince the Indian finance minister to raise the excise tax, particularly on the short, cheap cigarettes. But in 3 rounds of budget cycles, we've only won once, and the industry came back with all the tactics that Peter outlined in the last presentation, and we've lost the last 2 rounds of efforts to try to raise the taxes. And you see this in the discrepancy in that the main reason cigarettes are cheap in developing countries is because the excise tax is low. And this shows, for example, a comparison between high-income India, Bangladesh, and Pakistan. This is coming out in the BMJ next week. And it suggests that globally, if you triple the excise tax, you double the street price and raise about 100 billion more in revenue. Okay, what are the objections to tobacco control? You hear these repeatedly, job losses, it's nonsense because you don't spend money on tobacco, you spend it on other goods and services. Revenue loss, which is also not true. But the main argument you hear, which I want to spend time on increasingly, is that you're going to hurt the poor. Well, is this true? No, it's not. If we look in China for some work we did with the Asian Development Bank, if the taxes were increased by 50%, the question is who would bear that tax and who would bear the health benefit or who would gain the health benefit? And if you look by the marginal taxes by socioeconomic status, in the dark green is the taxes borne by the lowest socioeconomic group. They only bear 6% of the excess tax. But what about the deaths averted? Well, in fact, the poor, the lowest SES, gets about 32% of the health benefits. And in other populations where there isn't universal health coverage, like the Philippines or India, one of the biggest causes of poverty is catastrophic health expenditures, meaning houses have a seriously ill family member, they spend 10% of their income, they fall below the poverty line. And what we've demonstrated is that tobacco control, tobacco taxation, can actually decrease the numbers of people going into catastrophic health expenditure. And that is shown here on the income quintile, the poorest being at the left side of each scale, that the biggest benefits are in the poorest populations, either of a 50 or 100% tax increase. Okay, I've talked mostly about price, but there are obviously a set of non-price interventions that are very effective to get current smokers to quit. And they involve plain packaging, in which Australia has been a true pioneer, big local packet warnings, complete bans on advertising and smoking, efforts on counter-advertising, particularly now messages on cessation, and importantly, good ongoing epidemiological studies to inform risks and the benefits of cessation. In addition, getting clinical access to nicotine replacement is also important. Plain packaging is illustrated very importantly here as pioneering work in Australia. In Canada, there's been some very good work on prominent warning labels, and there's some studies that suggest that these are noticed. If you hand a package of Marlboros with this label to men in Canada, many of them turn it back and say, give me the one that says it's going to kill me. So they are being noticed. Okay, so to conclude, the big message is triple, halve, double. Now, if we could get a big increase in the excise tax, you could get a tripling of the price. That is achievable, as I've shown you in France and South Africa, increasing now in the Philippines. That would have smoking and the nice extra bit of getting some money for the revenues. But we shouldn't be chasing revenues, I believe, in public health. We should be focusing on the health benefits and let government use or misuse or waste the money that they raise. That's just normal politics. We should be concerned about the public health gains. And I'll show you the benefits, which is that we've estimated worldwide a tripling of the excise tax. This is the excise tax, not the price. A tripling of the excise tax in every country would reduce consumption by about a third, and in this century avoid about 200 million deaths. And recently in South Asia, we've worked out an example. So South Asia has got about 1.8 billion people, 30% of adult men, but only 4% of adult women smoke. And the effects you have to separate out differently between the current and future smokers who are below 35. And in those, they are very much likely to be like the US women in terms of their risks. If they start early and they don't quit, they're going to get the full decade of life lost. And then there's current smokers above 35. So we have two totals. And a one-third reduction in consumption would avoid something like 35 to 55 million deaths in these two groups, about 25 to 35 in the current and future smokers below 35, and something like 10 to 20 million in those above 35. Okay, so to conclude, prolonged smokers lose about a decade of life. This is the new 21st century evidence. It applies probably globally. Cessation by age 40 and preferably earlier avoids 90% of the risk to continued smoking. I hope I've shown you that the tobacco control is actually an important way of reducing both inequalities and reducing the consequences of poverty, and that the easiest way to think about this would be to argue for a tripling of the excise tax in every country. Our information is available on the web, and do feel free to contact me at the Twitter account, which is at Count the Dead. Thank you very much.